What was Kurt like as a person, aside from the music?
Well, he was very outgoing on stage, but off stage he was pretty quiet. He was philosophical. I had published this book called Experiencing Nirvana, and it's essentially us traveling with Nirvana for a week in Europe. Let me just share some of that story a little bit, because that's a time when I really had an opportunity to hang out with Kurt. So this is late November in '89. They had spent 6 weeks in a van with the Tad band. So you have 2 bands in a van traveling, crisscrossing Europe, getting super fried, right? Mm-hmm. So we get this message that Kurt is not doing well. Like, he is emotionally distraught. He's really fried. We know that there's this big showcase in London in a week, and we've got to get him to the show. So John and I scraped up some nickels and flew to Rome and met the band there. And I remember walking into the club, and Kurt was pretty receptive. We had some dinner. Things seemed to be going okay, but that night Kurt had a breakdown on stage, climbed a PA, threatened to jump, came backstage, told the band that the band was over. They was breaking up the band. He literally, I'm just going to say, had a nervous breakdown on stage. So John went for a walk outside with him, and Kurt said, when I look out in the audience, I'm seeing the kids who used to beat me up in high school. That's what I'm seeing. So that's kind of where he was coming from. Again, I told you he was a quiet, sensitive kid. He got harassed in high school a lot. So what we did is we told, the rest of the musicians just to head on up to Geneva, Switzerland, and that we would catch up via train. So what we did is we spent a day in Rome, seeing the sights, going to the Vatican, going to the Colosseum, eating good food, drinking good coffee, and taking a train up to see the rest of the band. So I got to spend a day in Rome with Kurt, along with my business partner, Jonathan. And the more I got to know Kurt, again, he was shy and not that talkative, but because I had a whole day to spend with him, I got to know what a deep thinker he was, and just a very interesting character. And just because he was quiet off stage didn't mean that he didn't have a lot of thoughts going on. So he was very appreciative of taking that time out to really experience the city. It was at that moment that I realized that this guy is very intelligent, creative person.
And were you surprised at all by that?
Yeah, I was, actually. He was exceptionally intelligent. And, I'd seen him at shows, and we, met at the office and so forth, but he didn't really say a whole lot. Chris did most of the talking when you were dealing with the band. So once I really got exposed to the depth of his personality, I had a deeper level of respect for him. And I was also seeing, after that, they played some shows, we followed them, they played London. They had some new tracks. Their show was dialed, and you could just see that the band at that point, by late '89, they were really coming into their own, and Kurt's songwriting was really getting more dialed. It was a turning point for me, because up until that time, most of my focus was on Mudhoney. I knew those guys. They were killing it. And Nirvana was just kind of like the opening act. The guys from Aberdeen, who are pretty good. That's kind of where we were at. But as a group, their creativity just continued to accelerate. And that's, to me, the most fascinating part of the story, is they just they grew so quickly.
When was the first time you really started to notice that growth?
Well, I'll tell you, we saw them. They came up to do a showcase in mid-April of '88. This was just a few weeks after John and I opened our offices. That summer, they recorded their first single for us, Love Buzz, which sounded great. It was a cover, though, again, showing you that Kurt's songwriting hadn't really matured. So the first single we released was a cover. We released it in November of 1988. The next day, one of my best friends, Charles Peterson, the photographer who had documented much of the scene, called me up and said, I threw a party last night, and I threw on Love Buzz, and we just kept playing it over and over and over. So, yeah, that was kind of my first hint when that single came out and got a tremendous response. One issue that came up with the single, an anecdote that a lot of people aren't familiar with, is when we released the single itself, it had a spoken word intro, kind of a little montage that you can't really find on the CD. But when he originally brought it to us, he wanted a 45-second montage that was very surreal and interesting, but I had to step in and be the corporate ogre and say, you know what? A little snippet of that is going to grab people's attention, but not 45 seconds. So Kurt and I would go back and forth on some of the creative stuff, and I felt it was a healthy relationship.
What was your relationship like with Kurt?
Kurt and I would say we were friends. We were colleagues for sure. We had a good rapport. You have to remember, though, that Kurt was living in Olympia at the time. I was living in Seattle. And Kurt really was a hermit of sorts. I remember visiting Olympia and talking to one of my best friends, Calvin Johnson, who ran K Records, who was also a very good friend of Kurt's. I said, "How's Kurt doing?" He goes, "Well, I haven't seen him for 6 months." And you got to realize Olympia is a small town. So Kurt, he liked to sleep in and stay up very, very late. So I didn't see him a whole lot other than the shows and in studio time, but I felt our rapport was really good, and I would say we definitely had a friendship.
So going back to the very beginning of your relationship with Nirvana, from what I understand, when Jonathan Poneman first showed you the Dale demo, you weren't really that impressed by it. What was your initial reaction to that demo?
My initial reaction was that I thought it sounded good, that Kurt had a great voice, but the songwriting was a little immature. That was my take. And I still feel that in reviewing their first album, Bleach, I'd say the same thing. There are a couple of classic tracks on there. I think Blue and About a Girl in particular really stand the test of time. But to me, the real star of that album is actually the producer, Jack Endino, because he created a record that just grabbed people with its essentially with its vibe and its presence. And he recorded for $600. So to me, Jack's the real genius behind that album. Kurt had a great voice, but the amazing thing about working with Nirvana is watching them grow and develop and get better and better and better. And that was an amazing thing to experience.
I have a copy of Nevermind, and on the back of the CD, there's the DGC logo, and right beside it, there's the Sub Pop logo, even though Sub Pop wasn't involved in the release of Nevermind. So how come the Sub Pop logo is on Nevermind? And also, what was the, legal process like getting Nirvana off of Sub Pop and onto DGC?
Well, what happened was, I'll give you the story. Nirvana signed to a 3-record deal. And that's
with you guys or with them?
With us. And that's okay. I'm going to tell you a story here. This is some stuff. At that time in the 80s, typically indie labels didn't work with contracts. They didn't have money for attorneys, right? So it was always a handshake deal. Hey, we'll split the profit. That was just the way indie labels did business. It's a handshake deal. But in 89, the summer of 89, a few months after Bleach had been out, Chris Novoselic came to my house and in a fairly aggressive way insisted that we sign them to an actual contract, okay, which totally saved our ass in the end, right? So we had no money for an attorney, so I called Poneman. He went to the library, he Xeroxed or photocopied a boilerplate contract, filled in Nirvana, cost us 10 cents, right? They come in, they sign it, and because we had that contract, when Nirvana decided to jump to a major label using the recording of their second album that we thought we were going to release with Butch Vig, again, we sent them to Butch Vig in Madison. They recorded the album. They came back, but what we didn't know is that they were sending that out as a demo to major labels. This is how it goes. So DGC stepped in and said, we're taking these guys. You're just going to have to deal with it, but we'll negotiate, a settlement. So it was kind of a bittersweet moment. They left the label. We were a little heartbroken, but that's life in the biz. But because they were signed to 2 more records, we were able to fine-tune the negotiation and get that logo on Nevermind, which is definitely a source of pride. We got royalties from In Utero and Nevermind, so that really helped us out tremendously. But it never would have happened if Chris Novoselic hadn't come to my house and demanded a contract. So life's funny that way. Sub Pop would have gone out of business 30 years ago if Novoselic hadn't asked for that contract. So sometimes these little things can turn your whole life around.
And does Chris know about this story?
Oh yeah, 100%.
What was Chad Channing like? You know, he's such an important member of that band, but unfortunately he gets overlooked sometimes. What was he like to work with?
He was a little bit like Kurt. He was both Kurt and Chad were very soft-spoken, okay? Sensitive, soft-spoken, creative types, for sure. Chris Novoselic was the exact opposite of that, which created a kind of an interesting dynamic. If you were backstage, Chris was the one who was bouncing up and down on the couch, and both Chad and Kurt were way more laid back. So, you know, ultimately it didn't work out for Chad, but he's a really sweet guy and super nice. One of the nicest guys you'll ever meet. And he and Kurt, I thought, complemented each other very well as personalities. That was my take.
Yeah, and you know, often, I mean, obviously Dave Grohl is one of the most, you know, famous drummers in rock and roll history, right? He's one of the best ones out there. But I also feel like Chad is still a good drummer. I just feel like he gets totally overshadowed because of the Dave thing. You know what I mean? I feel bad for the guy a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. And Chad, you know, I'm just going to scale back a little bit, and you had asked me, hey, when did you really feel that Nirvana was turning around? You know, initially we heard him, it wasn't with Chad. I think they're so. I remember the first show that Chad played, there was definitely a marked difference. A year later, you know, a year after that kind of debut in spring of 88, which would be like spring of 89, they released Bleach at this huge showcase that we set up, Tad Nirvana Mudhoney in Seattle. Bleach came out. By that time, their shows were really coming together. And if you check out any of the in-store shows or Google any of the shows from that period on, you're going to see them really come together. And Chad had a lot to do with that. I will say that.
One thing you said that stuck out to me is that Chad and Kurt had similar personalities.
Yeah, you know, yes. If you walked into a room and there were two quiet guys in the corner, it would be Chad and Kurt. Kurt was, you know, let's straight up, Kurt was a genius. Kurt was a genius, so he was a very creative person. He had more of a sense of humor. So if you had a conversation with him, it was always interesting. It was philosophical. He was a deep thinker. He was funny, but he was soft-spoken, and so was Chad. And that's kind of what I'm getting at, is they were both somewhat gentle personalities off stage. You know, Kurt could really flip a switch when he got on stage, for sure.
One of the things that's been very interesting for me over the past few years, having had the chance to speak to people like yourself and others who actually knew Nirvana on a personal level, is getting to hear that inside story of the band. So again, having known Nirvana personally, having known Kurt personally, how do you feel about the image of Kurt that's out there, that he's this bigger than life person?
You know, that's rock and roll. You know, that's they used to throw the term rock god around because that's how society would relate to people who could rock a coliseum. And I just think music does not have the same cultural impact as it did 25, 30 years ago. And my belief is that young people are so distracted with social media that music, like going home and listening to a whole album and really feeling it, young people have less and less time for that. They're too easily distracted. So I can't think of, this is one of the reasons why we keep circling back to Nirvana and Cobain, because at that time they had such a huge cultural impact, because Kurt was extremely talented and extremely outspoken, and really, I think it's been harder and harder for somebody to kind of step in and do that in part because music isn't as central to people's lives as it was at that time. If you spend two hours a day on Facebook, that's 2 hours less than you're spending listening to music.
Yeah, it's definitely a different landscape now. And so with that said, do you think it's possible for there to be a new underground band like Nirvana that could possibly go super viral, and not just go viral, but hold that popularity long term?
I'm just going to say it's just going to be a lot more difficult for, certainly there's popular artists out there that have millions and millions of Instagram followers and so forth. So I do think there are some artists out there who can kind of command that level of respect and attention. But there's not a lot because, again, people are so distracted. And the rock culture is weaker now than it used to be. That's pretty obvious. You look at the charts, what's popular. I mean, rock and roll, rock music, guitar music still exists, but it's culturally it's not in the ascendancy.
Do you think it could ever get back up there?
It could. Yes, it could, and there have been some moments, in the 21st century. I look at like a group like the White Stripes, for example, who are just like, wow, they're just a brilliant group. But I think Jack White was is probably as brilliant as Kurt Cobain, but they didn't have the traction that Nirvana did.
In terms of Nirvana's traction, Nirvana, of course, was the focal point of an entire movement. They were the focal point of the grunge explosion. And one of the key places in terms of the history of grunge is, of course, Olympia. I was recently in Olympia for a bit, and when I was there, it did strike me very much as a college town, so it's not surprising to me that a city like Olympia, which has a lot of creative, youthful energy, was one of the key places in terms of grunge's development. In your opinion, do you feel that Olympia's youthfulness contributed to the development of grunge?
Yeah, if you really want to get to the roots of it, I came of age in the punk era of the late 70s in Chicago. I came out to Olympia in 1979 to attend Evergreen State College. And thankfully, Evergreen had one of the most unique radio stations in the country. The station was called Chaos Radio, and it featured and promoted independent music. So that's where I got my schooling on indie music and how I was able to kind of initiate the Sub Pop project, which turned into the Sub Pop Records Corporation and so forth. So in a nutshell, Olympia had quite a history of independent thinkers, and I believe that Kurt really fed off that. In particular, there was a gentleman there by the name of Calvin Johnson, who I've mentioned previously, who I worked with at Chaos, who had started his own label, K Records. He was a singer in this group called Beat Happening. And Kurt was so enamored with Calvin that he tattooed the K Records logo on his arm, just to give you a feel for that. So I think Kurt really fed off the college energy of the town. Punks and indie music people in the town really influenced Kurt.
So when it comes to Kurt, one of the things that people debate about sometimes is, did Kurt want to become famous or did he not want to become famous? In your honest opinion, what do you think?
He totally wanted to be famous, but he also was very conflicted because he very much identified with punk ideals. And so that's what made the whole story so fascinating, is that conflict. And Sub Pop was kind of the same way. You had the sub, which is very underground, and pop, which is the implication that underground music could be popular. For Kurt to circle back and go to Steve Albini, that's a bold gesture. Steve's a good engineer, he's a good producer, but he's not super commercial. That was Nirvana's way of saying, we're gonna go with a slightly more abrasive approach. This time, our single is gonna be called Rape Me. I dare you to play that on radio. They had a punk side, so you'd see that conflict, and it was pretty fascinating. My biz partner John Poneman has gone on record as saying, like, he had some talks with Kurt, and I didn't know this at the time, but he recently said, yeah, I had talks with Kurt, and he was like, we should be selling millions of records, and he was very confident in Nirvana's potential to sell, and it's the main reason he left Sub Pop, that even though he sold 40,000 copies, which in the indie world was at that time successful, He was like, no, that's not good enough. We should be selling millions of records. And I was like, I wasn't thinking in those terms. I was not thinking that we're going to sign bands that will sell millions of records. That was not in my frame of mind at all. I did not think that was possible coming from where I did, where, things change quickly. That's for sure.
So with that said then, when DGC started selling millions of copies of Nevermind, considering that you were contractually, getting benefits from those sales, did you ever wake up like, is this actually happening?
Yeah, it was completely surreal. It was so weird. It became a global phenomenon, Nirvana, but also Soundgarden and Pearl Jam and all this other stuff, in addition to the Sub Pop brand. And just, we successfully marketed Seattle as a scene. That was kind of our shtick. And to go to cities like Tokyo or Barcelona and see Seattle grunge mania happening in cities around the world was really, it was pretty exciting. I'll share with you an anecdote just to give you a taste of the internet, what was happening internationally. By late 93, Sub Pop we struck a deal with Sony in Japan, and they were like the biggest record label. So I went over there with some American bands, Super Suckers, Fastbacks, and to do a showcase in Tokyo. And we arrive at the corporate headquarters of Sony. This is like the biggest, most powerful corporation in Japan. I walk up to the door, and there's a glass door that opens up, and they had spray painted the Sub Pop logo on these glass doors. This is just up for a day, but like, okay, that was punk. That was cool. So it just kept getting more over the top.
When it comes to Bleach, you forced Nirvana to change the track listing for that record. Originally, Kurt wanted to have Blue and About a Girl deeper down on the track listing, but you insisted that those songs had to be higher up, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. I'm really proud of that. I'm really proud of that because Kurt, again, we'd butt heads a little bit, but I thought it was healthy. He was pretty stubborn. He had, he goes, we're not doing a Charles Peterson photo on the cover. My girlfriend's got this shot. We want to do it negative. I'm like, oh, that's cool, But I'm telling him the sequence of your record is not going to work, my friend. You're taking your two best songs, Blue and About a Girl, and you're putting them on the end of side 2. Maybe if you're REM, you can get away with that, but you're a new band. You need to come out swinging. And then oftentimes the third track on your record is going to be the pop hit, the one with the hook that really gets people. So between Blue and About a Girl, we put it up front, and I was really firm about that. I said, I'm not budging on that. And so they had to go in and resplice the whole thing, and Kurt was kind of like upset that I was this authority figure who was telling him what to do. But I'm like, look, I've been in this business for a while, and trust me, this is good advice. So I'm not going to budge on that. So we did have a little back and forth there.
Hey, but it worked out.
It worked out. I stand by that sequence. I think opening up with Blue, it just kills it. FYI, just as an anecdote, I was in Oslo, Norway, late February at a music conference there. And part of the music conference is they have this classic album Sunday. So they invited me in, and we listened to Bleach on a stereo system that they told me was worth $100,000. It was like the finest gear in the world. I hadn't heard of any of this stuff. I'm not an audiophile. But we were in basically a pub or a tavern with 100 Norwegians drinking strong beer and listening to Bleach. It was a moment. But dropping that needle and hearing Blue, those bass lines, people were just down as soon as it dropped. Still holds up.
100%. And with specific regards to About a Girl, one of the things that I find interesting about the story of that song is the fact that Kurt was a bit apprehensive to put the song out there because he was concerned it may alienate his grunge audience, even though Jack and Dino told me that Kurt wanted to record the song. So he was clearly a little bit conflicted about the song. In your experience, did you ever find that he was apprehensive about a Girl?
A little bit. And, in the Sub Pop organization, John had more of the He was more interested in pop songwriting. It's one of the things that made the label kind of interesting, and I was more interested in like tracks like Blue was probably my favorite, and About a Girl was John's favorite. And John was going, Kurt is telling me he's listening to like a lot of Beatles, and the direction the band might go is just more of a pop sensibility. And, I'm open-minded. I thought, yeah, that's cool. I thought About a Girl was a great song, but he also told me that Kurt was feeling a little self-conscious because he wanted to go in a poppier direction.
So in terms of that more, I suppose, poppy, polished direction, what did you think about the production on Nevermind?
The production, Butch Vig wound up re-recording the record in LA, and then Andy Wallace wound up mixing it. So it had I love the production on Nevermind. They thought it was maybe a little too shiny, a little too commercial, but I think that's one of the things that made it so great. It's just everything came together, pop, noise, punk. If they had stuck with Sub Pop, we would have released the original Butch Vig recordings, and frankly, they just weren't as good as what finally came out, But I'm glad they wound up working with Butch because he's super, super skilled.
Do you have a relationship with Butch Vig?
I would say so. I bumped into him at a music conference in Chicago a couple years ago. Super nice guy. Also, Dave Grohl had put together a documentary series about different regional scenes, and they came to Seattle and did an epic show at the Showbox for like 3 or 4 hours promoting their involvement with his documentary. I saw Butch backstage there, and he's just a super nice guy and really, really talented.
Definitely. Now, did you have any kind of working relationship with Jason Everman when he was in Nirvana?
Not really. He's pretty noted as kind of a serious guy, a little sullen. Definitely rocked, took things very seriously. I thought it was good, when Nirvana played the Moore Theater in Seattle with 1,500 people at the Sub Pop Showcase, the Lame Fest, June 9th of 1989. Jason Everman got on stage. And if you see any of the shows from that tour, you can really see it coming together. He definitely added a lot of punch to the band, but just didn't work out. I will say this, that on the second edition of Bleach, a lot of people don't know this, the first edition had, the first 1,000 were white copies. The second edition were black, but we had a huge fold-out poster of Jason Everman. That was our way of saying, thanks for paying for the recording, bro.
So the white copies of Bleach, those are actually the original copies?
Yes. And the white ones are worth an insane amount of cash.
So in terms of the recording of Bleach, what memories stick out to you from that process?
Well, they did record the album in, I believe that was January of 89-ish, around that time. And I know John was the lead person on that. So it's typically like, yeah, get into Reciprocal, we'll cover it, and we'll put out your record. And everything was just oral agreement. Now, there is a kind of a bizarre twist to that story that has been noted, and it is a little ridiculous and kind of embarrassing, which is Kurt called me and said, we're about to go on Reciprocal, and we need you guys to cover the bill. And I had the audacity, and this is actually very embarrassing, to say, could you front me the money? Okay, the record label's supposed to come up with the cash, but just... can you guys cover it? We'll hit you later. That's how broke we were. And he basically hung up on me. But this second guitarist, Jason Everman, who didn't really play on the record, wound up paying the bill. They went into the studio and he wound up covering the bill. Again, $600. So it was, I'm sure that was negotiated again between Kurt and John. But I do remember Kurt asking me to come up with $600, and I didn't. You know what? And here's the trippy part of the story: Sub Pop never came up with that money, the $600. So when I said a $600 record that sells a couple million copies, I said that's a good investment. Well, the punchline to that story is we actually spent zero, so it was a zero investment and sold 2 million copies. So that might be the best, most profitable record in the history of the music business, if you look at it that way.
Yeah, you're probably right. Jack Endino and I spoke not too long ago, and he mentioned that in his view, Bleach is often overlooked when it comes to the story of Nirvana, even though Bleach set the foundation for what was to come with Nevermind and In Utero. So in your view, what is the importance of Bleach in the story of the band?
I think Bleach is super crucial for not only Nirvana, but for helping to establish the whole grunge vibe that was happening in Seattle. And I've stated before that Jack Endino, in my opinion, is the real star of that record. The band had a couple of great songs, but the production on that is so in your face. It's so present. I think that's really what helped sell the record was Jack Endino's sound. So the vibe of Bleach really helped, in my mind, help advertise the whole grunge vibe that was happening in Seattle, which was simpler songs that were really driving, really physical, weren't necessarily that pop. Soundgarden was doing that. Mudhoney was doing that. And all these bands had different flavors, but I think Bleach really kind of was more, helped set the tone for Seattle's identity as a rock city. And yes, it did help set the foundation for Nirvana's success, but really Nevermind is the record that put them on the map. Bleach just hinted at things to come, but again helped solidify Seattle's reputation as a city that rocked.
That's awesome. And so in terms of your history with the music business in Seattle, before Sub Pop, you used to work at Muzak, the company that's well known for making elevator music, as did several other people from the grunge scene. How exactly did that happen?
Seattle developed a niche in the industry called foreground music. So there are two different companies that provided soundtracks to restaurants where they weren't Muzak-y versions. They were actually the original songs. And so there was a growing demand for this, and the company I worked for did that. You'd go into a Caribbean restaurant and hear some real reggae. Well, all that stuff was put together at the Yesco company in Seattle. So this is like 85, 86, 87. I got a job there, and I started bringing in other musicians like Mark Arm from Mudhoney. Tad worked there. Okay, the first time I heard that Nirvana demo, it was at Muzak. And I say Muzak because Muzak stepped in and bought them out. So I started working for this one company, and then all of a sudden, a year later, I've got a business card that says Muzak on it. So yes, Mark Arm and Tad and half the musicians in Seattle did work for the Elevator Music Company, and they all have business cards with this on it. And during break time, people would come in like Tad Doyle. He came in and goes, "Hey, I played all the instruments on this. What do you think?" And I'm like, "This is great." And we put it out as one of the earliest Sub Pop singles. Another guy's name was Chris Pugh. He was in this group Swallow. He's like, "Hey, I just recorded this demo." I'm like, "Great, we'll put it out as a Sub Pop single." So I was doing Sub Pop business before John and I opened up our office out of Muzak. And I was actually shipping Sub Pop records out of the Muzak warehouse unbeknownst to Muzak. Distributors would call Muzak and they're trying to track me down, and the receptionist would go, "Hello, Muzak." They're like, "Is Bruce Pavitt from Sub Pop there?" And they'd be like, "Oh yeah, let me connect you." And then they'd be like, "Yeah, we need a couple hundred records." And I'm like, "No problem." I'd reach under my desk, grab a couple boxes, go over to my friend Chris Pugh and like, "Hey bro, can you mail this out to Rough Trade?" "No problem, my friend." I left Muzak in March of 88, and John and I opened up the doors to our downtown office in April of 88. So I was there about 3 years.
Of all the different experiences you've had in your career in the music industry, would you say that Chris Novoselic randomly showing up at your house and demanding a contract for Nirvana was one of the key moments in your career?
I'll go a little more detail on when he came to my house because, just to sketch it out, it was a total miracle because I was not at my house. I was next door at a party. There's a group from Minneapolis called Babes in Toyland. They were hanging out at my house. We went next door. We're all hanging out. And I thought, I'm going to step on the porch and get some fresh air. And I stepped on the porch to get some fresh air, and I saw Chris walking towards the house. And I'm like, "What's up?" And, just to color the situation, he'd been drinking. So he was it was a scary moment where he was like, we're getting a contract, and we went upstairs and we talked and I was trying to chill him out. So it was a miracle that we even crossed paths, because if I hadn't stepped out for that fresh air, he would have came to my house, probably would have got home, sobered up, and whether we would get a contract or not, I don't know if that ever happened.
Nevermind, of course, was released by DGC, and because of the contract you had with them, Sub Pop got substantial royalties from the sales of both Nevermind and In Utero, which, in your own words, basically saved the company from going under. But even before that, if you look at the history of Sub Pop prior to Nevermind, you guys had sold hundreds of thousands of records as a label. So, given Sub Pop's success, how come you guys were on that verge of going under at that point in time?
It's a never-ending... you got employees and you're hiring more employees. And we started out, I was calling the press, I was calling the radio. Then we hired somebody to do press, somebody to do radio. You expand, more bands. Oh, they need advances. Oh, okay, now they need vans. And so you never know how much money is going to be coming in, because distributors may go out of business. They may not pay you. The record may not sell as much as you thought. So it's an incredibly unstable business where you're shooting from the hip all the time. And at the end of the day, when we finally, that moment when we could barely come up with $100, we were probably like $200,000 in debt, which in the grand scheme of things is really not that bad. We just didn't have any credit, right? We had no credit. We just owed everybody in town money. And as soon as that Nirvana money came in, we paid those bills like that. So to do what we did, running on fumes, was a constant exercise in trying to be resourceful. And again, just to reemphasize a fact that a lot of people don't take into consideration is that at that time there'd be like 6 or 7 record distributors, and every year one of them would go out of business, and then somebody new would come in, and so you wouldn't get that cash. Okay, so that's one of the reasons we started selling directly to stores and stuff. It was hard to get paid, totally crazy. You never knew if you're going to have a hit record, and I would never do it again in a million years, but I'm glad I did it once.
Looking back at your career with Sub Pop, what are some of your favorite memories?
That's a good question. I think there's so many layers to it. Seeing Nevermind go to number 1 and knock Michael Jackson off the charts. And, it's got the Sub Pop logo on the back. And the label sending us millions of dollars, and the bands on Saturday Night Live. It was like, for people in indie rock, it was like, I say it's like the fall of the Berlin Wall. The fact that a band could go from the indie culture straight up to number 1 was a miracle that people have been praying for ever since the punk rock culture happened in the late 70s, and it hadn't happened. So that might be the moment, but there are a lot of minor moments too. Just the success of the Singles Club and Sony Records spray painting their door. There's just a lot of weird little highlights, but Nevermind going to number 1 is probably it.
You mentioned a little earlier that Sub Pop also got royalties from In Utero. What's your connection to that record?
Well, we just had royalties on because we had them signed to a 3-record contract. They had put out Bleach, so that we got royalties on their next 2 records. Incesticide was a co-production between us and DGC, so that was a separate project, so we got royalties from that as well. And Bleach, of course, has sold like 2 million copies by this point. Think about this, a $600 recording selling 2 million records. That's pretty unusual.
Yeah, that is really cool. And just so you know, by the way, in terms of In Utero, this was a couple years ago. I went to Steve Albini's studio in Chicago.
Oh.
And in his office, behind his desk, he has a big Sub Pop sticker. I'm not sure if you're aware of that.
Really? No way.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks for sharing that, man. Really? Thanks for sharing that. Well, I'm a huge Steve Albini fan. The very first album we put out was a collection of music from around the country. And the first track on the album is Steve Albini just doing a spoken intro. And it's just called, I said, Steve, can you just say some crazy shit? I don't care what it is. We're going to throw it on the record. And it's called Spoken Word Intro Thing. We sent bands out to Chicago to record with him. This band Tad we worked with, they recorded with him and so forth. And so Nirvana when they went to the majors, they were able to draw on some of the best talents of the indie scene, like the producer Butch Vig, the producer Steve Albini. These were two of the best producers in the indie scene. And so what was very cool about Nirvana is they really empowered and gave work to people in that network. And I have a lot of respect for them for doing that. The mainstream, the mainstream came to Nirvana. Nirvana didn't go to the mainstream, and that's what was so amazing about the band.
When it comes specifically to Bleach, that record sold 40,000 copies before Nevermind was released, so within those 2 years, approximately before Nevermind came out. And, at first 40,000 doesn't seem like a big number, but if you think about it, a new band on an indie label, 40,000 is a big number. How does an indie label even get to that level where it can sell 40,000 copies of an album? Does the question make sense?
No, it's a good question, because at that time in, 88, 89, 90, those numbers were pretty high, and it was hard to do that. It was hard to do that. And I would say one of the things that really worked for us was the fact that we only signed bands at that time that had really good live shows, and we would really encourage the bands to tour. In some cases, we even bought some vans and would, loan those out to groups. And so that relentless touring that happened for a few years, people really got behind the brand. So whenever something came out on Sub Pop, people would automatically snatch it up. We had the press behind us. We had the live shows that were really crushing it. And I think that had a lot to do with it. It was just the reputation built upon the tremendous live shows and also the media attention. So it was unusual to get that level of success. And I'm going to add one more thing. We were very aggressive with the 7-inch singles. So a lot of labels had kind of abandoned that format. But the cool thing about singles is you can just be popping those out every week. So every week we could call a store and go, we got a new record out, we got a new record out, we got a new record out. And that helped build the momentum really quickly. Even though that new record just cost us like $500, right? It was still a new record, and you could have an excuse to call a store.
One of the things about Bleach that I find interesting is that it was originally meant to be an EP, but the band insisted on it being an LP. Is this correct?
I haven't thought about that in a long time, but that does sound correct, because we were doing a series of EPs. The Mudhoney's first release was an EP. Soundgarden's first release was an EP. And that is, I'm going to say that's true. I haven't thought about it for a while, but yeah, that was definitely my thinking at the time. I wanted to get records to critics and stations that just had 4 or 5 of the best tracks with the best fidelity, because those 12-inch singles, those 12-inch EPs, they sounded better. So that was definitely the strategy when the label started to initiate the grunge thing in Seattle. But Kurt was a pretty stubborn guy, so we went back and forth on stuff, and he definitely had his own way of thinking for sure.
So you mentioned that the recordings Nirvana did with Butch Vig in 1990 were originally meant to be used for the second Nirvana Sub Pop record, even though in actuality Nirvana ended up sending those recordings around trying to get a different deal with a different label. When did you first realize that was happening?
I'll tell you, for some reason, I think I was really pretty oblivious, even though Poneman was like, I hear they're kind of shopping around, and I was literally just still interpreting that as like, no, that wouldn't happen. Those are just rumors. And I think he was way more savvy on that than I was. And in fact, that summer, he said, go down and visit Kurt and tell him he's got to stick with Sub Pop, convince him to stay with the label. And I did. I went down there and I brought him some records of outsider artists like Daniel Johnston. Hi, how are you? I gave him that album. You later see him wearing that T-shirt everywhere. Well, yeah. that was a gift, and it was my way of saying we are always going to support the outsiders. Corporations are not going to do that, so we are going to respect your creativity and support Nirvana. And he also knew we were pretty broke at the time, so it's my understanding he had made up his mind. But still, in my mind, I literally couldn't imagine them doing that, even though I went through this whole process and went down there. And John's like, I think major labels are looking at them. And then he had me go visit them in Las Vegas when they were touring with Sonic Youth. And I go to Las Vegas, and in the dressing room, there's a couple of guys from DGC, and it's a little strange, but I'm like, oh, the DGC guys are here, and we're chit-chatting, and, in retrospect, it's just totally obvious what was going on. But I think I just didn't think they would actually do it, that they would stay indie because they were very punk in spirit. And at that time, very few bands did that. So it was almost inconceivable to me that they would actually do that. And that's obviously what was going on the whole time.
So when did you first realize that Nirvana was in fact going to leave the label?
Well, I will tell you, they did a show in September at this garage. It's kind of an infamous show. I'm trying to remember the name of this garage.
The Motorsports?
Motorsports garage. Thank you. The Motorsports show was kind of their last indie Sub Pop related show. And unbeknownst to Danny Peters, who was drumming with them, they had already decided that they were going to bring in Dave Grohl. I didn't know anything about the Grohl situation. Sub Pop had just put out a single, Sliver and Dive by Nirvana. And Nirvana just kept telling us, hey, we need some time before we put out the album, so here's a single. So that's what they're telling me, right? And I'm just taking that at face value. So it was right after that show, somebody basically said, we're seeing Nirvana riding around in limos. You know that, right? Everybody's courting them. And I'm still like, no, it's not happening. It was just like this weird psychological thing. And finally somebody said, dude, they signed to DGC. And I think I kind of snapped. I remember being just profoundly sad, like that it sunk in that, yes, this is happening. It's kind of like you hear maybe your girlfriend's cheating on you and you're like, no, that wouldn't happen. And then next thing you know, you don't have a girlfriend anymore. It's a little bit like that, and the mind does funny things when it doesn't want to deal with reality.
But then, obviously, it has that Cinderella ending when they blew up and it kind of, saved the label.
Yeah,
right?
it does. So it really worked for everybody in a way. But see, there's just so many layers to the story. And this is where I'm going to get a little sad here, is that they blew up. And from a business point of view and a cultural point of view, is tremendous. But then you have layers and layers of this pressure with Kurt, and he's no longer with us, So there's so many different ways of looking at the story. But ultimately, it's safe to say that they had a tremendous cultural impact and really changed a lot of lives for the better. And I think we can all be really glad about that.
So in general, what was that experience like for you where Nirvana's no longer on your label, but you're still getting the financial benefits of them taking off all of a sudden and just seeing your friends become famous?
It was exciting to watch that happen. I really didn't see Kurt a whole lot after that, but I did see him at some key moments, me personally. So, there's money coming into the label. We're signing new acts, like literally millions of dollars are pouring in. Whereas, like I said, we had less than $100 in August of 91. That all changed within 6 months. We're rehiring, we're re-signing. Bleach is going through the roof. We sell 1 million copies of Bleach. Again, millions of dollars are coming in. So that was all exciting. And then for us, the mania that happened in Seattle, you'd have camera crews coming in from Spain. And of course, we had an office, so they could always get an interview with us. And I remember doing like an interview a day for at least a year because the Seattle grunge thing was blowing up. So it was ridiculous. It was exciting. It was a little weird. But ultimately, it was an amazing time. I will say that the last time I really had a good conversation with Kurt was at a key point in their career, was after their set that they played Saturday Night Live. They played Saturday Night Live like the second Saturday in January. Their record had just knocked Michael Jackson off the #1 spot. It was kind of the peak of the explosion. They play Saturday Night Live. So they're selling 400,000 records a week. And I went backstage after the show and I got to hang out with Kurt. And it was just him and me talking. And he was really glad to see me, and you could tell that he was just in an ecstatic state that they were achieving so much success. And he told me how much he wanted to open a petting zoo for children, and he had all these fantasies and stuff he was going to do with his cash, and he goes, kids are asking me for my autograph, and even though supposedly Nirvana didn't do autographs, that was kind of a thing you would hear. He specifically told me that he was honored. He was enjoying being a rock star. He was straight up. He's like, kids are asking me for autographs. It's cool. It was good. He was in a really good place.
If I may ask, do you have any regrets from your time with Nirvana, or are you content with how things played out?
I tend to be a no regrets kind of person. I'm just really honored that I was able to have the relationship that we did. And that's the funny thing about history. You can go, well, wouldn't it have been better if this happened or that happened? But, it all kind of unfolded in this mind-blowing way. So I would, if I could go back in time, I wouldn't touch a thing because, it was what it was. So no regrets. I wouldn't change a thing. If I was writing the movie script, I'd be like, no, keep the script that way.
You're really set on getting this movie done.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, the scriptwriter who did Straight Outta Compton has already put together a script and he's shopping it around. So it actually could happen.
Really? About Sub Pop or Nirvana?
It's actually about Sub Pop, but there's definitely some Nirvana scene. In fact, the first scene in the script is Kurt on top of the PA stack in Rome.
Do you have a favorite Nirvana song?
A song that I really like a lot that's underrated, and it's more on an obscure list. If I had to pick a song that I think is underrated, it would have to be the original version of Been a Son. After they did Bleach, we put them back in a studio with the producer Steve Fisk, and they recorded 2 songs, Stain and Been a Son. And then we released a 12-inch EP, right? I finally got my EP out there with Love Buzz and Big Cheese on the other side. And that came out in England. So when they toured the UK in '89, this is when Kurt kind of had his breakdown, and we did the Lame Fest showcase, and they totally blew everybody away. We had that EP out, and on that EP has this song called Been a Son. There's a couple different versions out, but the original one I think sounds great, and it's one of my favorite songs, and I just recommend people check it out.
Was there ever any point in time in Sub Pop's history where you felt like, you know what, things just aren't working out, let's pack it in? Did you ever get to that kind of a point?
Yeah, and the funny thing about that is I was just going through the timeline the other day, and I would say late August of '91, John and I were about the only ones left in the office. We had laid off the staff, and we went to a convention that my friend Calvin put together in Olympia called the International Pop Underground Convention. Fugazi was there, L7 was there, all sorts of bands were there. We went down there, and a photographer came up to me and said, that check you gave me last week for $100, that bounced. And I'm a little upset about that. I'm like, oh man, I'm so sorry. So I went to my bank account and drained my personal account and gave him my last $100 because our company didn't even have $100, okay? Now you got to realize this is late August. So a few days after that, what happens, DGC is shipping Smells Like Teen Spirit to radio. A week later, it starts blowing up. A month later, the record's selling. 4 months later, we do the math and we're due at least $500,000 from Geffen. A month later, we're like, oh, we're actually due $1 million from Geffen. So this, just at that moment where you're like, we literally cannot come up with $100. This is the scene in the movie where we're supposed to just pack it in, and we almost did. But it turned around miraculously, so I think that's an epic timeline.
That's amazing. So how did it feel, knowing that the company was about to go into the ground, and then all of a sudden Teen Spirit blows up and basically saves the company?
That felt incredible. As soon as it came out, I was getting phone calls from all over the country. A friend of mine in Chicago was saying, I just heard that song blasting out of a taxi cab that just drove past my window. There was a nightclub in Seattle called The Vogue, which was a dance club, And a DJ called me up and he said, you know what? I never play rock, but last night I thought I'm going to try Smells Like Teen Spirit. And it was the hit of the night. So I'm like, it's getting played in taxi cabs. It's getting played in dance clubs. Boom, boom, boom. Next thing you know, it's on MTV and it was beyond, beyond. It was an incredible rush. And then when you saw them go into regular rotation on MTV, game over,
When you first heard Smells Like Teen Spirit, did you think it was something special?
Absolutely. Although I had some criticisms of their earlier work, I remember John and we were down at this Seattle nightclub, and a representative from DGC, this is probably August of 91, said she had a tape of the album, and we went outside and we went in her car, we threw it on, we heard it from front to back. And every second of that record was blowing our minds. We instinctively knew that it was going to be huge. And especially Smells Like Teen Spirit. As soon as we heard it, we're like speechless. Knew it was going to not, they were knocking it out of the park. And to see that confirmation was, that was so exciting that I just knew that there was never going to be another moment in my life in the music business that was going to rival that.
Really?
Absolutely. And I remember I exited the biz a couple decades ago to raise some kids and kind of do something else. But I knew that there's no way that I'm ever going to experience that level of excitement again. I did it. I can park that.
Really? What specifically made you feel that strongly about that?
Well, just, to put things in perspective, I had been an indie music activist for a decade at that point. The whole point of the Sub Pop zine and radio show, et cetera, was to promote these regional bands that would typically press 1,000 singles. If they sold 5,000 albums, that was a really big deal. 15,000 was knocking it out of the park. So that was the culture during the 80s. Things started to ramp up a little. Sales were getting a little better. But I had seen years and years of small regional bands barely eking out a living. And to see Nirvana, who had gone from 1,000 copies of their, Love Buzz single to selling 400,000 records a week by January of 92 was such an extreme turnaround that it was literally mind-blowing.
Yeah, I mean, even when it comes to Bleach, that record sold 40,000 copies initially, which that in itself is, still pretty good.
That was good numbers. At that time, that was considered a really successful record. If you could sell 40,000, 50,000 indie records, that was pretty darn good. Now, I also want to mention, just for some context, is that right as Smells Like Teen Spirit came out, Sub Pop simultaneously released an album by Mudhoney, who released an album called Every Good Boy Deserves Fudge, and that wound up selling 100,000 records, which, those are great numbers, and that record really helped us out as well, but it was dwarfed by the millions and millions of sales of Nevermind. But I want to give Mudhoney their due because they actually had a hit record there.
I was talking to Jack and Dino a little while back, and he mentioned that in his opinion, and in the opinions of others in the scene from the early days, they thought that if a band was going to blow up from that scene, it would have been Mudhoney.
Well, in 88, Mudhoney started, I was at their first show, and out of the box, they were amazing. One of the best live bands I've ever seen in my life. Great songs, their songwriting was strong, their live presence was amazing. And when they went over to Europe and toured Europe, they won over the British press, and they were really leading the way. Now, a story that I tell in a book that I released called Experiencing Nirvana has to do with a Sub Pop showcase in London in December of 89, where Nirvana opened, Scroop Tad played second, and Nirvana finished up. 2,000 seat club. And the show did very, very well, but Nirvana kind of won over the British press at that time. And that was about the point where you could see things tipping a little bit. But prior to that, Mudhoney was really leading the charge. But that's what's so cool about working with a group of artists. You know, you're all working to support each other, and it all works out in the end.
One of the things that really stands out to me about Sub Pop from the early years is the fact that the company started off totally from the ground up without any financing. How did you get to that point where you started actually getting financing to release material?
Dude, that was so hard. That was so incredibly hard that when the Hollywood movie finally comes out, people will be so entertained with the desperation that we experienced every day because we had no money. But at the same time, we knew that the world really wanted to hear this music. It was blowing up in England. We were getting great reviews. So we did a few things that were very unusual business-wise for cash flow. We might have been the first label to call stores directly and sell COD. And we would get away with this by saying, you know, we've got limited edition copies of these records, and if you want to get these, like this Nirvana single we just put out that we only made 1,000, then you're going to want to buy from us directly and pay cash on delivery. We also worked through distributors and so forth, but those distributors would take months and months and months to pay, and that was killing us. So by going directly to retail, we're able to get our cash flow turned around. Additionally, with our limited releases, we did a singles club. So we went direct to customers through mail order and said, listen, if you send us $35, $50 in advance, you'll be guaranteed to get these records. And they were super collectible right out of the box. So we were getting checks every day from people all over the world. And that helped us out. But even then, it was excruciating trying to keep the company afloat.
One of the things that Sub Pop is well known for is its sense of humor. The Dear Loser thing, of course, the world headquarters spiel. Is there any reason in particular why you guys chose to have a sarcastic image?
Just that sarcasm just came naturally. We did release this t-shirt that said loser on it and with the Sub Pop logo on the back. We thought it was funny. And there was this moment, again, there are these cultural moments where you're like, I can't believe this is happening. So a year or two after we put out this shirt, it was like 91, 92, I'm watching the David Letterman show. And their cameraman is panning the audience and zeroes in on somebody wearing a loser shirt. And Dave starts cracking up. Like, what the fuck is this? And I'm like, yeah, we made it, you know. We got our shirt on the Letterman show. Just little things like that were just kind of funny and ridiculous. To create something that's kind of snarky and ridiculous and have the king of snark, Dave Letterman, crack up, that was a moment for sure.
That's funny. Well, actually, if I'm not mistaken, David Letterman's favorite song, isn't it Everlong by the Foos?
Wow, I hadn't heard that. That's cool.
Yeah,
I did not know that.
As a matter of fact, if I remember correctly, I think the very last song performed on the Letterman show was
Really?
Everlong by the Foos.
That's great. Didn't know that one. That's a great story.
I have a question about Nirvana and Sub Pop 200. On that compilation record, you guys included Spank Through. Was there any particular reason why you guys chose that song specifically?
You know, that's a good question. I don't really know. I think it's because they chose to put that one on there. That's the most likely scenario. But I will say that compilation Sub Pop 200 really did put Seattle on the map as far as I'm concerned. Side anecdote here, in London, there was a BBC DJ, John Peel, who was considered maybe the number one tastemaker in the world. He had a radio show. He wrote reviews, and he really embraced Sub Pop 200. He did a review in the London Observer that has like 2 million readers. And he essentially said that Sub Pop had the most distinctive regional sound since Motown, which was an epic endorsement. So collectively, all these bands working together, unified by Jack Endino's recording, unified by Charles Peterson's photography, really made an impact. And after that Peel review, a lot of the British press, which was very influential, kind of started backing us up. So we had a lot of hype behind us.
That's awesome. And so you mentioned now that the Sub Pop bands were unified by a few common elements like Jack Endino's producing, Charles Peterson's photography. Did the humorous, sarcastic image of the label in any way serve as a unifying factor itself?
A lot of the early musicians had a great sense of humor. Mark Arm in particular, the Mudhoney Crew, Tad, all these groups had a great sense of humor, which is one of the reasons their live shows were so good. But I think I was a little more involved in the marketing, and I was just having fun with it. You know, we had no money, but we played this corporate shtick. One of our great scams was we had a tiny little office on the 11th floor of this building called the Terminal Sales Building. So we took an epic photo of the building, and when we released a compilation called Sub Pop 200, people opened up the box set. You know, it wasn't just a compilation, it was a box set with a booklet of photos by Charles Peterson, and there, right in the booklet was the photo of Sub Pop World Headquarters. So people are looking at this going, damn, these guys are ballers. You know, it's like 11-story building, but no, we literally had a 600-foot office in that building. The manager of the building told us we couldn't do that anymore. Punk rock at that time, as defined by like Maximum Rock and Roll, the magazine, for example, was increasingly, a lot of respect to Maximum Rock and Roll, but there was a lot of emphasis on being anti-corporate and having a real strong political focus. And our political focus was like, we're working with great bands and we want them to get paid. You know, that was basically our point of view. So we kind of played the corporate shtick a little bit just to go against the grain. And in the world of media, it's all about getting people's attention. So if somebody's doing one thing, sometimes you just got to do the opposite just to get people's attention.
Sub Pop has always championed indie and underground artists. So when Sub Pop itself was an underground indie label, was there any kind of a communal vibe between you guys and the artists themselves? Absolutely.
And the indie culture at that time was all about music fans doing whatever it took to get records out. That was the intention. And if we could just cover our bills, that was reward enough. One thing that Sub Pop did that doesn't get nearly enough attention, in my opinion, is we were hyping the Seattle thing. There was a Seattle focus with grunge and so forth. But we're also networking with bands from all over the country, and we were rapidly putting out a whole series of singles, 7-inch singles by bands from all over the country, which got record stores in Dallas and Chicago and Detroit and New York more and more excited about what we were doing because we were paying respect to their scenes. And so that was really a key to becoming more of a national label, because in the background, we were really hyping a lot of other regional bands as well.
Thanks for watching, guys. If you like what you see, make sure to subscribe for more. All the videos on this channel are original. I'm the one conducting all the interviews and editing all the videos together. So if you guys like what you see and you want to support, the best way to do so is honestly just to subscribe. Lots more to come.